there is a problem in the United States, and frankly, they don't even know how to meet their own energy needs. This is going to cost a lot of money to American citizens, to the working class in the United States. Electricity bills are going to go sky high. Local communities are going to suffer. This is going to cause massive retaliation within the US. And yet somehow the US is going to master plan, is going to become the world's major energy hub, is going to cut off China. I think this is a little far fetched when you start breaking down the material realities on the ground.
All right, welcome back, everybody. We are back for round two. Kareem can't be with us today. He sends his regards. But Alina, I just wanted to, before we delve into the most recent news of the day and then get into kind of part two of what you wanted to talk about, would you mind just refreshing our memory of the main points that you covered last week? Also, for the people who might not see the first part and are only coming in now.
Yes, obviously we covered a lot within an hour, and how I would best synopsize that is we kind of got into discussing and focusing a little bit on the oil markets, what the US war on Iran was trying to accomplish in terms of its war on global energy, the argument essentially that is trying to wipe out competitors and essentially establish itself as a global energy power hub that's going to replace oil from other parts of the world for for major importers rather. We also obviously got into and discussed how Venezuela fits into this, because obviously we know, following the illegal kidnapping of President Maduro, that the United States is putting a lot of legal measures in place to essentially control the finances of Venezuela, its oil imports and exports, or imports, sorry, its exports, its
Mhm.
oil income, revenues, and how that plays into its sales. So essentially, what we are looking at when it comes to Venezuela is that they're trying to return back to the status quo of what Venezuela was over, around 30 years ago, where it was just a rentier kind of state for American oil corporations. And itself, it was relying on royalties. And fundamentally, it was American oil. Big oil that was controlling the Venezuelan economy and its production. So we kind of discussed that, how feasible that is in terms of, like, will we see any actual productive outcome for this with regards to the United States. And if I remember correctly as well, we also covered the extent to the type of oil that the United States has. Can it replace medium heavy crude that's coming from, especially from the Gulf states? But even in terms of how why Venezuela is important for American oil refineries. So we covered a lot of these kind of topics, and yeah, I think it's very important to understand the nuances between how the global oil market works, the different types of oil. Can the United States actually replace that kind of oil? Can Venezuela is Venezuela able to actually produce enough oil based on its declining infrastructure to be become of any sort of it can be classified as an actual win for the United States, other than obviously cutting its ties between China and Venezuela, which I think is the only benefit that has come out from this, and how Iran fits into this. And I think we also touched on other topics. We spoke a little bit about AI. We spoke about how whether Iran has been successful, or if, as rather, whether the war in Iran has been successful. If not, why not? So we kind of got into all these topics as well. And hopefully today we can actually get into LNG, gas, the argument that obviously the United States, again, is trying to take out its competitors, especially, for example, in the Gulf states, looking at obviously what happened to the world's largest LNG sort of refining, infrastructure in Qatar. And if indeed the United States is actually able to replace that LNG, what this means for world markets, industrial productive output, and how again this will affect the United States, which again we covered in the previous episode, but now we can obviously expand on and also discuss AI a little more as well.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. And I would just add to that, it's easy to forget about the whack jobs, Cuban American whack jobs, and their influence over U.S. foreign policy. And I think a big part of that takeover, well, I don't know what the right word would be, but changing of the regime, making changes within the same regime. I don't know what the hell we want to call it, but certainly cutting off Venezuelan oil from Cuba was a major victory for the right wing
Yeah.
Cuban American whack jobs that apparently still have a lot of influence in this administration, and recently have been pushing for a military invasion of Cuba to give Trump a win after the quagmire in Iran. So, at any rate,
Hmm.
we're recording this on the 15th of June. This is the basically the first day, full day, I guess, of the announced truce. I don't know what we're calling it, temporary truce. And so, of
Hmm.
course, by the time this gets out, it's entirely possible that the crackpots and fanatics in either Washington or Tel Aviv have successfully sabotaged the deal. Hopefully not, but that's entirely possible. So as we talk now, I think like a week and a half since our first talk, the situation has changed somewhat. I'm cautiously optimistic. How about you? How are you viewing? Just before we get onto the meat and potatoes of the fossil fuel markets, how are you reacting to the news of this truce?
Very cautiously, if I'm being very honest, very cautiously, because I mean, ultimately, as well, we don't really know yet what this deal actually entails. We've seen different kind of sources. We've seen in Farsi media, obviously, they put forward we've seen the 14 um, point plan that has been sort of circulated through Iran, and we've seen obviously some Western media outlets also kind of report on that. If we were to use that and say, okay, this is indeed what the plan is, which again, we're going to find out because supposedly this is going to be signed in Switzerland, if I'm not correct, on the 19th, which is
Mm-hmm.
it's just Friday, or is
Yeah.
it Thursday? Um, so, we're going to see to what extent this is accurate. But I mean, when you actually sit down and look at the 14-point plan, it's a temporary truce. The final sort of signing of a permanent ceasefire would actually be after 60 days when other points have actually been discussed and negotiated. Therefore, if that doesn't actually take place, then we'll see sort of like the renewal of the same process all over again. Obviously, within that 14-point proposal, there is wins for Iran. There are significant wins, and again, if this is true, this would be great. This would be a massive success for Iran, because what they were essentially stating is that that the United States and its allies will bring together around 300, was it 300 billion, in terms of like providing Iran with compensation or ability to kind of reconstruct itself after the war. They were discussing, obviously, actually establishing a timeline by which to remove sanctions on Iran gradually. They said as of immediately when this is signed on the 19th, they're going to remove the oil sanctions at the very least, and on sanctions on petrochemicals through those 60 days. But the remaining sanctions will continue until the second part, I guess, of this ceasefire agreement is signed in 60 days from now. Obviously, it also includes Lebanon, which is very important as well. The idea is that not just the United States, but its allies, therefore, in this case, meaning Israel, is obliged to stop the war on all fronts. And Lebanon was exclusively sort of outlined in what this 14-point plan is that, we've seen circulating by Iranian media. So these are important wins. There's no real. I mean, we haven't seen anything with regards to the toll on the Strait of Hormuz. But then again, in terms of the toll itself, if Iran is able to have sanctions lifted and essentially receive some sort of major compensation in order to rebuild itself after the impacts of the wars had on its own economy and its basic infrastructure, then it doesn't necessarily need the toll. Again, this would be a massive win for Iran. And supposedly the negotiations of the next 60 days, if this goes to plan, it would basically have to do with, Iran remaining within the nuclear proliferation treaty, making sure, or confirming, validating that they will not seek um, you know, uh, 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 nuclear bombs, and so I mean. it's supposed the way it's been sort of kind of presented is that the major point that they need to discuss going forward after this is signed on the 19th has everything to do with nuclear proliferation and making sure they don't establish any sort of weapons that can be deemed as a threat to the United States, even though we know that even by intelligence assessments from American intelligence that even if that was to happen, this wouldn't be a threat to the United States. But either way, we understand what the threat really means here. So this is kind of what the 14-point plan looks like, based again on the information that's been circulating through Iran, but it hasn't been confirmed by Iranian politicians, obviously at this stage, or any or the U.S. Government itself. So we're going to see. We'll see if this holds until the 19th. But then again, like I said, even after that, there's a lot of aspects that are still ambiguous and are going to be decided upon in the next 60 days. So we know how that's always gone in the past. So we'll see.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, just listening to you lay out some of the points, it kind of strains credulity to imagine over the next week, though, or not next week, but the next few weeks, the next 60 days, really, all of those items actually surviving the domestic political challenges. The Republican neocons are going to be raising hell over this. A lot of Democratic politicians are probably going to fall in line with them and raise hell about these from a different angle, but basically the same angle. And that's not even saying anything about the Israeli government and their military trying to, sabotage this through violence and murdering people. So it's just so hard to even listen to you say some of these points and then imagining those points being absorbed. It's one of those immovable forces, irresistible forces meets an immovable object sort of thing. The domestic political constraints, the Israeli pressure, or the U.S. Israeli pressure. But then you have the global economic system and the massive amount of damage that the continued closure of the Strait of Hormuz and potentially more. It's just
Hmm.
it's hard to see how it gets resolved in a way that's beneficial to humanity. But God willing, I hope I just am suffering from a lack of imagination here. But
No, you're not. I think you're quite a realist in that sense. But go on.
oh, okay, no, I just wanted to kind of shift back to the kind of broader overview of global energy markets that you were helping to provide a couple of weeks ago. And if we could kind of, thank you so much for going over and giving the recap of what you discussed last time. And I think now would be a good time to shift to where we stand now. If this truce actually does persist, and in the best case scenario, we see regular traffic resuming in about a week's time or so. Uh, Again, best case scenario, what do you think the sort of resumption of normal or quasi normal trade will do to energy markets, to the supply of fertilizers, helium, all of the things that we've been learning over the past 100 days. If that does go through as intended, or in the best case scenario, how do you see the impacts playing out?
Well, I mean, listen, it's going to take time to be able to return to the kind of energy security and the markets to calm down as they were prior to the war. I mean, the recent estimates that we're looking at, based on experts who obviously have a bit more of an understanding as to this, we're looking up to like maybe even up to 8 months, if not more, depending on how this situation also kind of is able to materialize based on the deal that we've currently seen. Because going back to the 14-point proposal, the idea is as well that as soon as this is signed on the 19th, traffic should return to normal, to pre-war levels, pretty much throughout these 60 days. That's kind of the idea at this point. But then again, you still have that instability within Iran, within the war on Iran, in terms of will it continue, will it not continue, what will happen after the 60-day period is done, will the war actually continue, and this will also have an impact on the global markets, on oil, on LNG, on prices, on fertilizers. So again, it's it's going to be, we haven't actually even reached the signing of the deal. Even when we do at this particular point, it's not the end stage. We have another 60 days. That's another 2 months of instability within one of the world's most important, trade sort of rate routes in the world. And it's going to probably therefore even make the situation even worse. It's probably going to extend the period by which we can sort of start to normalize the markets by another how many months. So it's not going to actually do a good deal very much, and the impacts of the war on Iran are going to be felt for a very long time to come. So I think this is just kind of like like a little brief explanation as to how and to what extent we can return back to normal. It's not something that we can just go back to. Oh, peace has come. The memorandum of understanding has been signed, and everything's going to flow back to normal, because that's just not how refineries work. That's not how trade works. That's not how
Mhm.
the markets work. They can calm down, but it does take time to actually begin to get the trade even itself to circulate, and to kind of re-inject back into economies, whether it's not just energy, but like you said, fertilizers, among other vital, you know, uh, trading goods.
Hmm. And backing up what you said, I just was looking at the futures markets for oil. It seems like it certainly hasn't gone down to the pre-war level, which would be what you would expect if this truce were to return everything to the status quo ante very quickly. And I think the futures market for oil has been kind of crazy and untrustworthy, not producing a reliable signal. But at least on that point, I would agree with the majority of people currently trading. But maybe we could transition to that broader point you were talking about in our last conversation, which, in my view, it's sort of like trying to correct for a narrative understanding of the world in which the U.S. is really like 1,000 feet tall and is currently just going from triumph to triumph in securing greater and greater dominance of the global energy trade, and perhaps creating or establishing the dollar in an even more unassailable position as the global reserve currency, if it were the case that this war were actually cementing U.S. energy dominance. And that's what you were, I think, very helpfully pointing out the flaws in that reasoning, and the fact that that story is not terribly likely to be accurate. That the U.S. is not 1,000 feet tall and about to dominate energy markets, but you really focused a lot on oil. And I was wondering if you wanted to shift to natural gas.
Mhm. Mhm. Right. So the prevailing narrative that's kind of become very popularized right now, is sort of the theory that the United States, as I said in my sort of introduction, is trying to take out its competitors, particularly within the Gulf. And as we discussed in the previous episode, actually, we also did discuss why the Gulf is fundamental to the American economy, due to the petrodollar, due to the recycling of dollars into the American economy from the Gulf states, how significant the Gulf states are in terms of, the sovereign wealth funds, their money that goes into basically balance the deficit of the US economy, but also to invest in major projects, especially in AI, which is something we also discussed in the previous episodes for those that are interested. So, again, highlighting the importance of the Gulf states. But the idea here is that, the obviously the ongoing war on Iran, beyond the fact obviously that it's shut down effectively the Strait of Hormuz, due to the tensions, but also because of the blockade itself that the US has imposed. Many people have argued the US is continuing the war because it wants to not only, affect the trade of its allies in the region, but also the attacks, I guess the exchange of fire that's obviously seen a destruction of one of the world's, or if not the world's largest LNG refinery, which in Qatar, which will now see production levels decrease by approximately 18 to 20% over the next 4 to 5 years, until the infrastructure is essentially, rebuilt or fixed in order to reach its, full potential, because this is the statistics that we're currently looking at.
Yeah, Elena, could
Um,
I just interrupt to
yeah,
ask a follow up question on
yeah.
that? I've I really don't feel like I have a solid understanding of the extent of the damage that has already been done to the energy infrastructure in the region. You remember, there was so much censorship during the
Mhm.
first, 30, 60 days of the war on satellite images of the actual damage. Have you been able to ascertain really the extent of the damage and the likely time it would take to repair all of that infrastructure in order to return back to normal?
Well, I haven't actually seen. I mean, what I have basically based on my research, what I found is what a lot of experts have. I guess people who are more, who understand the infrastructure, the damage that's been caused, and what it would require in order to kind of rebuild it again. And the estimates are within. I think something like I've seen different ranges, up to like 100 billion that would be needed to fix the
Wow.
infrastructure, but then it could also be much less. So at this moment, I haven't got a accurate understanding, but what I have seen and what I have seen to be a fact is that there's a unanimous sort of consensus that it will take up to 5 years even to make sure that this the kind of the infrastructure has been completely rebuilt to a point that it can function again as normal. And these are complex infrastructures, by the way, and something that people I was going to obviously mention going forward in this episode, but we can actually even begin to explore it now, is
Mm,
that building LNG refineries or LNG plants overall is one of the most complex manufacturing, or rather, one of the most complex infrastructure to actually establish, in alongside even semiconductor fabs. This isn't an easy undertaking. It's actually a very complex one, and this is why it takes as long as it does. And it does also depend on what kind of infrastructure has been damaged. So
mm,
because a lot of it does require a lot of advanced technology expertise, engineers who are going to have to come down and fix everything. And just for perspective here as well, I think in the previous episode we had discussed one of the limitations, again going back to the GCC states, that when you reduce, when they have a when their exports in fossil fuels has significantly reduced, and that is one of the kind of the basis of their own economies, is one of the strongest aspects of their economies, this exports in oil and gas. That obviously, we said in the previous episode, is going to affect the amount of investment in AI and tech, etc.
mhm,
And because it's going to reduce the money that they're willing to put into the United States, and this should be a problem. And I think as well, we saw the Council of Foreign Relations publish a really good and important piece on this. However, there's been another recent piece that was published that found that actually the Gulf states haven't reduced their investment, but actually they have redirected it. And the reason I bring this up is because what this research, what we've seen based on their investment sort of pattern so far, is that although they're still investing in the United States, they are now investing more in China, the global South. And in the case of PIF, which is the Saudi sort of wealth fund, 80% now of its portfolio over the next 5 years is going to be invested in Saudi Arabia itself. This is going to affect the United States, but it also says something with regards to the damage to its own infrastructure. The same can be said about Qatar. The same can be said about the UAE. The reason they're redirecting a lot of this investment is obviously to rebuild infrastructure, not only in its energy infrastructure, oil, gas, etc., but also civilian infrastructure, and then massive now investments in military sort of defense systems for itself, because it's found a lot of these states realize how vulnerable they actually are. Obviously, that aspect, that angle, is a plus to the United States to a certain extent, because where they're going to be, where they're going to be purchasing the vast majority of their military infrastructure from and defense systems, most
mhm,
likely from the United States. But then, and I think we touched this in the previous episode to a certain extent, the degree to which the United States can actually, has the industrial base to be able to mass produce to meet its own military needs, that of the EU, its Asian allies, and now the Gulf states, who are in a dire need to, rapidly, bring up its own defense infrastructure, is very questionable. But it's going to be great for the defense industry stock market, and and its CEOs. So that, but this also, again, it just highlights, I think, the extent of the damage on a lot of the infrastructure inside the Gulf monarchy states. So although I can't necessarily, pinpoint the exact numbers, because again, it's very speculative at the moment, and we're going to have a clearer understanding probably after the war is over, whenever that's going to be, it's clear based on the estimates that have been provided thus far that it's going to take several years for the vast majority of the Gulf states to be able to, you know, rebuild its infrastructure, and its defense systems as a whole, and to be able to function to at the same level that they were pre the Iran war. But just to get back to the LNG refineries, which is because I obviously started discussing the LNG, the world's largest LNG refinery in Qatar, that was damaged rather significantly, and that's that in that case we've been told it will take 3 to 5 years in order to be able to kind of restore the LNG infrastructure that's necessary. Um, there's a very important aspect here that I think we have to consider. So yes, it's going to take many years. And this is the main argument, will the United States therefore replace LNG that has been exported from the Gulf? Well, obviously not. The Gulf states are still going to be producing LNG, but it will be at a lower rate. Yes, but they still will be producing. The vast majority of the Asian states rely even in terms of China. When China, the LNG that China does use, which is actually a very small percentage of its energy consumption overall. In fact, it's only at 9%. 9% is the use of gas overall for its energy consumption, and LNG only makes up 3% of that. But of that 3% predominantly comes, I think half of that comes actually from the Gulf states, and that will continue when the war is over, because production can is still possible, reduced but still possible.
Hmm.
That's the one aspect. The second aspect behind this is the idea that the United States would be able to make up that difference, and there's an issue with this. The fundamental issue being that the United States has reached its peak in terms of what it can actually export. It is now mass producing LNG to its full capacity. And this matters when we're talking about the United States being able to provide the world with the LNG that has been, that it needs, especially after the war and the impact that it's had on some of the refineries within the region. Because there's layers to this. So when we're talking about the United States producing LNG, most of that is actually produced through fracking,
Hmm.
and that's the vast majority of LNG comes from that. But also, as you know, gas is also produced as a natural part of oil production as well. As the United States produces gas through these two mediums that it does so, it's then gathered, and once it's sort of cleared and purified to a certain extent, it then goes into the pipelines. It's transported all the way to the LNG export terminals, but also like the LNG plants,
Hmm.
where that's where the gas is turned into liquefied natural gas, and then it's once that takes place, they have it in certain very sophisticated storage units, which are sort of like massive refrigerator systems. And then from there on, the LNG is placed into LNG tankers, which are very specific tankers that are made to carry LNG, and then they're exported. And the countries that receive the LNG then have to have the proper sort of platforms to actually be able to import it, the pipelines that kind of inject that into its own economy, and a system by which to turn the LNG back into gas that can then be used in their own economies. So this is, I think, something that people need to understand when we're talking about LNG, how this actually operates, and what we mean by the fact that the United States is actually bottlenecked in terms of how much it can actually produce at the moment. Because,
Hold on,
yeah,
one clarification. I
before I
just
go
want
further.
to make sure I've got the layers that you've been explaining thus far. So there's
Mhm.
the most recent one you're describing is export capacity. Forget about how much LNG exists in the United States. Forget about how much can be produced every year. There's another potential bottleneck that comes in the form of, does the U.S. have enough of the facilities required for cooling this gas down into liquid form, storing it, putting it on tankers? Is the tanker fleet sufficient? So that's one aspect, and that's separate from the amount of attainable or capturable natural gas within the United States itself, and also separate from the cost of getting that, of extracting that. And these are all different layers. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. So, because effectively, like I said, you can fracking in of itself, first of all, also has a lot of problems because it has it's considered to be an environmental hazard,
Mhm.
and there are many legal issues ongoing in the United States with regards to fracking, how it's affecting local communities, and so this is one major issue, but. Just to put this into perspective, no matter how much gas the United States is able to produce, it actually produces too much, more than it actually can export,
Mhm.
meaning that all its terminals, its pipelines to LNG refineries, all of that is being used to its maximum capacity. So the extra gas that is actually produced in the United States, because the United States actually lacks the storage facilities to be able to store it, which would actually be useful for the United States because they could use it in order to deal with its own energy needs, especially going forward when they're looking at building at least another 1,000, sorry, 500 data centers in just the next year and a half, to 2 years. Um, they can't actually, store it. So what they do, they either vent it or they flare it. Flaring tends to be the preferred option because it's less environmentally harmful than venting it.
Mhm.
So they actually just burn it. They destroy it because they're producing in so much gas, but they don't have the capacity to export it. So this should actually get people to understand when we're talking about the United States being able to replace the Gulf states, they're actually having to get rid of gas and sell it at prices far cheaper because they have no way to get it out.
Mhm.
And when we're talking about building the infrastructure, building the pipelines, building more LNG plants so they can, increase the capacity that they're exporting. Again, these are very major projects. You need to secure land and territory, which is another, again, based on a lot of legal claims against, a lot of these corporations in terms of using stretches of land to be able to establish these pipelines. But then also, it takes years to be able to do so. These terminals, rather, not pipelines, like they're more like terminals. It takes an average of 7 years to do so. Will the licenses be issued to begin with? It requires tens of billions to be able to build. The same thing goes for LNG plants, and you would have to build more LNG plants if you want to be able to essentially increase your actual exports in gas. And like I said earlier on, the LNG refineries and LNG plants, rather, are very expensive, not just expensive, but very complex infrastructure to build. This is not something that's going to happen overnight.
Mhm.
This would require at least a decade worth of investment in infrastructure. In LNG, you would have to deal with a lot of legal disputes, environmental claims to be able to establish. It's not just something that can happen overnight. And and even something as simple as building the massive refrigerating systems, or maybe, I guess one solution would be, to establish, like I said, storage systems for for this extra gas with next to where the gas is actually produced.
Mhm.
Even that is a very expensive and complicated endeavor that the United States at this particular stage cannot, um, is not able to manage, not at a fast enough rate to be able to meet global demand. And that's why there have been, I can't remember now which media outlet it was, but there's also been lots of articles about this, meaning that yes, there is an increase in demand for American LNG, but can they actually meet that demand?
Mhm.
And just to provide a bit of perspective on that as well, the EU this year, or rather exports to the EU, in the last 3 months have actually reduced, whereas exports of LNG to Asia have increased. Why? Because it's only just so much that the United States can actually produce, and they sent it to, they basically exported to the highest bidder, which in this case were a lot of the Asian states. That meant that the EU, who has become now so reliant on the United States following, obviously, its sanctions war against Russia, that the reduction in LNG for the EU has been, very significant in terms of its own economy, its own productive capacity, and it also goes to show how volatile the EU is overall now, and it's
Mhm.
placed itself in that position willingly by, antagonizing its bread and butter, which was Russia and its cheap gas and pipelines into Europe. So, I mean, this just goes to show, there's only that much supply, and it can only go so far, that it had to be rationed out differently, and whoever was willing to pay the most,
Mhm.
those are the people that were able to have access to American LNG. But again, this just proves the United States cannot rapidly build up the infrastructure it
Hmm.
needs in order to meet that demand. And this is something that's often very overlooked when we're having these conversations.
Yeah, I wanted to ask. You mentioned Europe, and I wanted to ask specifically about that because there's another angle to this. It seems in my mind, and that is just the basic, capitalist logic, business logic of these firms themselves. And I would imagine that if they look at the current situation around the world, they think, okay, this is great for us. Certainly, more demand for our products, wonderful, but that's now. If the war in Ukraine is wrapped up, European customers are not going to want to import our much more expensive shipped on ships, container ships from the US LNG when we can just get it from a pipeline from Russia once, theoretically, if that
Hmm.
war is wrapped up. And then you just said that some of this infrastructure can take up to 7 years to build. So if you're looking at it from just a basic business perspective, you have to be very confident that this same demand is going to exist in 7+ years. So, do you think that what role do you think that is playing? I mean, sorry, this is a very messy question, but it kind of gets to the point of, is this really a brilliant masterstroke on the part of U.S. imperial planners, or rather just a kind of concatenation of events that they would, everyone making up that system would attempt to exploit, but it sounds like there's really not that much room to exploit given everything you've said, and then also on top of that, the business considerations, unless I've got that wrong.
No, you're right. So, actually, you made a good point. I just wanted to also bring this up, and then I'm going to answer your question. So, you also mentioned the ships. It's also worth noting there that the United States, in terms of LNG tankers, has one registered, like it has one LNG tanker of its own, but it's okay because it
Mm,
uses other tankers from other countries around the world. And it uses, and they just basically put on the American flag and so forth.
mm.
However, these ships cost up to $1 billion to actually produce $1 billion. Two countries in the world have the expertise at producing them.
China, South
That's
Korea.
China and South Korea. Yeah, China and South Korea.
Mm,
To therefore again to export to be if we even manage to bypass all the other process that I mentioned and manage to increase capacity through creating the infrastructure in the U.S., then you need to build more the ships necessary, more ships to be able to actually export. And there's only around 20, I think an average of 20 shipyards in the world that produce these ships that again are take I think up to 30 months to be able to produce about $1 billion. And the interesting thing is here is that the shipyards that they're built in, which again aren't that many, because there are so few, they are reserved and booked in advance for for up to years in advance. So there's actually, to the extent to how fast you can even mass produce these in order to actually export LNG at a faster rate,
mm,
again, is very questionable. So it's just something to also bear in mind. And again, look who are the countries that excel at producing the ships that the United States would need in order to increase its LNG exports: China and South Korea.
mhm,
China being the country that it's trying to target in terms of its master plan, and South Korea, an ally that, as I said in my previous episode, the United States actually relies on for the vast majority of its supply chains in
mhm,
AI tech, but even in even when it comes to, like, the production of LNG tankers, among other things. So the fact that right now the United States has issued a major war on global energy that is affecting for its own allies, and I said this before, its own supply chains that are very significant, specifically countries like South Korea, Japan, and obviously for in terms of semiconductors and other things, Taiwan plays a role into this.
mhm,
It's actually, again, it's affecting the United States itself because it's constraining their own capacity to keep up with their own productive capacity, their own technological innovation that the US relies on, but also in things like this that would again help the United States if, for example, they're able to mass produce or increase, investments in production of, LNG tankers, which again is difficult, like I said anyway, because the shipyards are reserved for a significant time in advance. That affects the United States' ability to become this hub and coerce
mhm,
the world essentially to keep the dollar because it's this hub of, it's the world's major energy hub. Um, Now, with regards to, what you said about the master plan. I mean, that's a very broad question, so I'm trying to
Yeah,
think
I
how to
know.
break it down. Uh, yeah. So, um, is it a master plan? What we can say for sure, and I think I had said it briefly in the introduction of the previous episode, is that we do know that the United States, and this is, we can all agree to this, is targeting to eliminate its adversaries and anybody that's going to challenge its, imperial power and hegemony over the world. The number one country, therefore, the end goal here has always been China, right?
Mm,
This is something that we can all agree on, and therefore I do agree with that. However, when we say plan, right, it I have a bit of an issue with that word because it kind of conflates three different aspects in one. Because on the one hand, we can have objectives.
mhm,
The other is how we execute how to what extent we can materially execute in order to achieve said objectives, and I guess like the outcomes of that, right?
mhm,
um, the reality of the situation is that the United States has goals. How it will achieve those goals constantly evolve based on the material realities at present. So, for example, with regards to Iran, the Iran war, of course, there's been multiple papers published on this, dating back from the even early 2000s. And one of the papers that is often referenced, for example, is the Path to Persia, that was published in 2009 by the Brookings Institute. And if you look at that, there's chapter after chapter of multiple different ways by which to essentially weaken and target Iran, coercing them to capitulate. The final sort of the Hail Mary option was always to go to war with Iran,
mm,
because when you sit down, I mean, even from as early as 2009, and that was prior to the, I guess, the rise of BRICS and multipolarity, and Iran's material conditions has dramatically changed since. It's far more powerful now than it was in 2009. But even then, based on that report, we had seen that the United States had stated, the intelligence apparatus had essentially agreed that there would be catastrophic impacts for the U.S. in terms of, its political status around the world. They knew then that what this would have done to the Strait of Hormuz, how that would impact its allies, the United States' own economic sort of base,
mhm,
as a result of its impact on its allies. So it was really a Hail Mary option when you weigh the pros and cons. And the reason I bring that up is that it goes to show that there are goals, but the way by which you achieve those goals keep changing. So it's not really a master plan. It's more
mhm,
so it's adapting constantly because previous means by which to achieve the same goals have failed.
mhm,
And so it's a mistake to act as though what the United States is doing now is this calculated 5D chess, and it's everything is going smoothly. It's not. It was an option of last resort. Itself, it was erratic. It was desperate, much like the kidnapping of Maduro, much like even now the war in Cuba, is a desperate attempt to, yes, try to diminish and weaken BRICS, isolate China, and try to cut off, supposedly China from its energy sources, not now, but in the long run. This is how the United States is functioning. By creating the kind of chaos and destruction that will obstruct any sort of future, all the investments that China has already made in a lot of these regions. For example, Venezuela is a classic example of that. So this is what the United States is trying to do. But this is the issue. In doing so, it's actually affecting itself more so than China. And I think earlier on, to put this into perspective in this episode, I had actually said that when somebody looks at China's overall energy consumption, for example,
mhm,
about 55% of that is still comes from coal plants. They are planning on reducing that, and China's doing, it's basically leading right now in green energy.
mhm.
Green energy actually makes up around 18 to 20% of China's energy consumption at the moment, and they're planning on increasing that.
Yeah, just to
And I think
clarify,
there's around,
that's
yeah,
consumption, not capacity. That's actual
yeah,
use. Yeah.
capacity.
No, no,
Yeah, yeah,
it's
that's
consumption,
actual
right?
use.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm,
Just, yeah, it is consumption. And then we have around, I think 20% of energy consumption is oil. If I'm correct, I'm not. Yeah, I think it's around 20%, and around 9%, as I said earlier, is gas. of which that 9% only 3% is LNG. And so when we start making that argument that, oh, see,
Mhm.
because this is an argument that we've heard, the United States has succeeded in cutting China off of the its LNG export imports um, from the Gulf states. It's going to coerce China to depend on the United States for LNG imports. I mean, why would they need to do that?
Mhm.
They can find other meat. First of all, like I said earlier in this conversation, LNG will still be extracted from the Gulf states, but just albeit at just a lower level. That would be more than enough for China, and again, it can just merely increase its natural gas from Central Asia and Russia, which can do so going forward. So it's not going to this idea that China is going to lose its edge because it's going to be coerced to rely on energy that's going to coming from the United States is very far fetched when you start looking at those numbers.
Mhm.
And so when we're like, this is some grand plan to secure the dollar by creating that dependence on LNG, is a bit, it's a bit. I think it kind of overstates it, if United States capacity, but also to the extent that China itself relies on LNG to begin with, and also how well China is prepared for this. China has known well in advance that what was coming in terms of the United States war on China and how it would probably try to attack energy. And so China has prepared for this. They have, at least we all know this at this point, 6 months worth of oil reserve, stored up
Mhm.
for its own energy uses. But even in terms of LNG, again, a nice example that I think can put things into perspective. China has stored up so much LNG that actually it was selling LNG.
Mhm.
It's excess LNG that it didn't need on the markets in order to help stabilize the prices
Mhm.
as well of global LNG, because obviously that benefits China as well in terms of its, being it's the world's largest industrial exporting power. So this is when you start to kind of contextualize that and see that China was actually selling excess LNG. It only relies 3% of its energy consumption overall LNG. Sorry, this idea, like I said, that there's a master plan to take out China by taking control of all these energy resources. Again, it falls flat. And when you look at how the United States is able to tackle this itself in the U.S., how it's impossible for it to actually increase that capacity, um, that falls apart even more. And I think at this point, I actually want to bring up one thing, and another very important point. That is, the US itself is struggling with, and it will struggle rather, with an energy kind of crisis of its own. There has been multiple research papers that have essentially discussed that the pressure of AI data centers is going to have on the country's electricity grid and its ability to essentially be able to run these AI data centers. And we've already seen in vast areas of the United States, and I mentioned in the previous episode about Lake Tahoe. Lake Tahoe was that local, like the energy providers have essentially said that they're going to be providing electricity to local data centers as opposed to the communities there. And this is becoming a rapid problem now in the United States. And so when you look at the United States and discuss and talk about in the context of they're going to become the world's energy exporter, how are they going to do that when they're unable to even meet their own demands? Is one question that I have.
Mhm.
They're looking at building, like I said, they have around 5,000 data centers at the moment, are trying to increase it by 1,500. And each year, for perspective, the United States actually is only able to increase its grid by something on an average of around 50 gigawatts. By comparison, China is able to increase its electricity grid by about 500 gigawatts, which is about um, more than half of the entire U.S. energy grid as a whole. This is what the China is able to accomplish, and this has become a very major problem. And in fact, it's such a major problem that the CEO of OpenAI had actually written an open letter to the state. And I think I had it somewhere here, because I actually wanted to just quote it. So yeah, this was written to Michael Grazios, the executive director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, yes, from the CEO of OpenAI. And basically, it says here, according to an OpenAI internal analysis, just the first 1 trillion invested in AI infrastructure, he says, is going to result in a 5% additional GDP growth. And he makes these claims without explaining why, but to argue why the state should increase its basically investment in energy infrastructure in the US,
Mm.
because, as he goes on to say in this particular letter, it won't be able to keep up with the AI race and and basically the AI data centers that they're trying to build. And he says, we described how the national security imperative to lead the world AI uh, is one of the most important in this century. And he basically goes on to say that if they don't manage to reach the the energy production that they need to meet the AI needs, essentially the AI bubble will eventually deflate. And he makes the comment here, in 2024, the People's Republic of China added 429 gigawatts of new power capacity. That's more than a third of the entire US grid and more than half of all global electricity growth. That's just in China.
Mm-hmm.
The US contributed just 51 gigawatts. So there is a problem in the United States. And frankly, they don't even know how to meet their own energy needs. This is going to cost a lot of money to American citizens, to the working class in the United States. Electricity bills are going to go sky high. Local communities are going to suffer. This is going to cause massive retaliation within the US. And yet somehow the US is got a master plan, is going to become the world's major energy hub, is going to cut off China. I think this is a little far fetched when you start breaking down the material realities on the ground.
I just want to push back a little bit, Alina, because you were spreading Chinese propaganda. See, all of that
Oh,
opposition to data centers in the US, you might think it's organic and grassroots, but no. In fact, it's all the Chinese government tricking people in the US to be angry because their electricity bill shot through the roof and they're worried about their water supply.
mhm.
It's all a bunch of Chinese propaganda. So I just wanted to correct the record there.
Yeah,
I'm joking, of course.
yeah, yeah, I know. I'm very sorry. I didn't mean to spread Chinese propaganda. I
Yeah,
do
that's
deeply
normally
apologize.
my
I'm glad
job.
you called me out.
That's where I live. But the when I got the call from the government, I was like, guys, I'm not going to do your job. You need to pay me more. And they just haven't raised their price to the level where I'm going to oppose data set. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway,
No.
we are close to an hour, so I just kind of wanted to wrap up and at least point out what I find to be the most interesting or useful or maybe even important takeaway from all of the information you've been able to provide. And to me, that is it. It really, I think, fatally undercuts the idea that, again, the U.S. empire is this 1,000-foot tall giant that can never be defeated, that is just going from victory to victory to victory, and is always using a master plan that's always implemented with success. Because that kind of narrative, that kind of understanding, I think, tends to create just depression and inaction on the part of people who would otherwise be attempting to oppose the empire, like an anti-imperialist league like the US used to have back in a century ago. So I think you're complicating that narrative with aspects of reality. I think is really important. The U.S. empire is not, the Borg. The people who comprise it are not the Borg. They don't all think with a unibrain and are able to just implement exactly what they want everywhere they want. We I think I got this phrase from Aaron Good, who no one would accuse of being sanguine and optimistic and a Pollyanna, etc. But his term is that the U.S. system is basically was it pluralistic oligarchy or oligarchic pluralism, which is kind of a joke within poli sci because it's supposed to be a democratic pluralist society, blah blah blah. But the takeaway, I think, the most important takeaway from that is just that in an oligarchic pluralist society, you have competition among oligarchs, and that competition oftentimes frustrates the goals of some parts of the oligarchy. And I think what your intervention here helps do is to kind of eradicate an idea of an a omnipotent empire that there's no point in resisting it because everything that they do is all part of their plan originally. And maybe even if you fight against it and achieve some goal, actually that goal was also part of the plan. You've been tricked. So anyway, I don't want to drag this out too long. That's what I take away from this, and I think it's a message that people should really on board, so to speak. But is there anything else? We're almost at an hour. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but if there's anything else that you'd like to share with the viewers and the listeners to try to help their understanding develop, please feel free.
Well, I guess I could just conclude. And then also, there was one point I would like to make at
Hmm.
just the very end. But just to conclude and round up, like you just said, yeah, I think it's very important to understand that, what we're seeing in the United States is sort of, the relations of production in the United States simply, are not, I do not, are surpassed by, sorry, cannot be surpassed by the production, capacity of the country. And so, for the United States at the moment, it's in a state of crisis in many ways. It's has to, supposedly win this AI race in order to sustain itself. Yet it doesn't have the energy infrastructure. It's in deindustrialized to the point that it can't build the necessary infrastructure. That's going to take many years.
Hmm.
It would also need the mineral earths and resources that it doesn't have because, again, it abandoned these forms of, industries a good long time ago as it opted to become a financialized economy, and it outsourced all of that. It's placed the leverage in the hands of its very kind of opponents, so to speak.
Hmm.
And now it is desperately trying to fight time in order to, or rather, to delay the inevitable. But in doing so, it's actually accelerating its own contradictions within the US itself. So when we're talking about the United States becoming this major energy hub and dominating, it becomes limited by the material realities. And the realities are that the United States just cannot meet the demands that it has of its own self. And as a result, this will cause the AI bubble. And I do focus on that a little bit more fundamentally because of the enormous impact that the tech industry overall has in
Hmm.
terms of its own stock market and the overall value of its economy, as well as obviously the financial, sort of Wall Street also has. But again, tech has a major it's a major portion of the current US kind of economic output, so to speak.
Hmm.
And so when that bubble deflates, when they're unable to meet those demands, like I said, the internal chaos in the US alone, it will cause a crisis within the US that it will be able to deal with in its own state, not to mention expanding and sustaining its imperial ambitions abroad, which are costly themselves.
Hmm.
Not to mention that this war, as I said earlier, has had a very negative economic impact on its own allies in the region and also its allies in Asia that again it depends on. So this hasn't been a win for the United States. Yes, the refineries have been shut down. Yes, LNG prices have gone up. Yes, the stock market values of these companies have increased and oil giants have made short-term gains. But we have to understand the difference between short-term gains and long-term gains. The U.S. as a very finance capitalist economy, as a capitalist economy more
Hmm.
broadly, is constantly focused on these short-term gains,
Yeah.
and I think that's people need to understand. And I also want to make a last little note, like a nice little, just to put I could put a bit of perspective on this as well.
Hmm.
I actually had read a bit by Goldman Sachs had actually produced an interesting statistic
Hmm.
of the all the billions made and invested rather in the AI industry overall. 90% of it goes to semiconductor fabs, chips, memory chips, etc. Only 10% of the money invested in the AI industry overall goes into building the infrastructure for it. That should tell us how significant, how the strain and the, I guess, the wall that the US is going to hit at some point sooner or later. So always remember this: there are goals. How can those goals be achieved? Can other materially attainable? And when you start to break it down, the answer is not. And actually, one little point that I wanted to mention based on the previous episode, I guess, that we had, I think it's important to clarify. And it obviously had to do with the Strait of Hormuz. Obviously, I made the statement that imposing a toll on the Strait of Hormuz is considered to be a violation of international law, and a lot of people became very frustrated with that point.
Mhm.
And I need to be very clear. It doesn't mean that first of all, that's my personal opinion. As
Mhm.
a person with a legal background, I'm just pointing out that international law dictates that there is that the Strait of Hormuz is a transit passage. And under international law, no tolls can be imposed in those areas. Now, some people I did see try to compare it to the Suez Canal and and the Panama Canal, but there is a difference. The reason that there are tolls paid in those particular, strips is fundamentally because they're man-made. And there's a lot of money that needs to go into the maintenance of these canals to begin with, because they're not natural waterways in the same way, for example, like the Strait of Hormuz is. So, because of that, tolls are paid to Egypt, Panama, etc., in order to be able to help them maintain these very crucial kind of choke points. The Strait of Hormuz is technically not considered that, and so the idea is, and this was based on UNICLOS, which was passed in, was it in 1982, is that there's a rites of passage for international maritime, and so because of that, imposing a toll would technically be violation of international law, but that can be challenged, and Iran is now currently challenging that, and there is a difference between innocent passage and transit passage, and so this is a complex legal case, and there is a basis for what Iran could argue to impose a toll. And by the way, we have also seen that with the sort of Turkish Strait. But the thing is, the Turkish Strait was established. The reason there's a toll, it was established prior to the 1982 law, and it's not retrospective. So. This is just something that I need people to understand. Of course, then there's a whole other legal jurisprudence argument that can be made. A lot of international law was made to protect the interests of the imperial core.
Mhm.
If you start looking at the history of that, and I've gone into that at length on my own other platforms for those that are interested. And one of the reasons that they imposed the UNICLOS was because a lot of significant what's sort of trade choke points passed through
Mhm.
territories that were a part of the global south or hostile to the United States and the West.
Mhm.
And so they established this as a means to keep control and access to these territories. I don't, of course, agree with that, but this is just what it is. And so we have to distinguish between, what is and what isn't, without taking that personally. So that was just like a little quick point that I
Mhm.
also wanted to clarify based on some of the
Yeah.
conversations that happened after the previous episode.
Yeah, and I just add my 2 cents as a retired lawyer who only studied this stuff like 20 years ago and barely remembers most of it. But I would just say, first of all, the answer to most legal questions, including this one, is it depends. And so don't. And the second point I would just make is that international law doesn't really matter all that much anyway. Sadly, I mean that's not something I'm happy with. I would much rather live in a world governed by actual international law. But sadly, the powerful states, primarily my own government, just rips it to shreds by their policies, by their actions. So just keep that in mind. And I think the point that one of the many points you were making there that I think should satisfy those who hear, oh my God, it's not perfectly legal, then Elina must be pro U.S., anti Iran in this. No, 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 no. International law is always contested. I don't even know. Like, we could probably nerd out on this and discuss whether uh, uh, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is now customary international law. So then it binds Iran, and there's probably people who would argue that it's not. And because
Yeah,
Iran,
yeah.
so like,
Hmm.
who cares? It doesn't really matter. Sadly, international law just doesn't make any difference in this shitty world. But we could talk for another few hours, I'm sure, on that. I just wanted to,
Oh yeah, 100%.
yeah, just wanted to thank you again so much, Alina. It was a real pleasure to talk with you, and to try to plumb the depths of your knowledge about this area of the global economy that has become extremely important of late. And I hope that we can talk again in the near future with some very positive developments to discuss. It's still entirely possible. As I think we both agreed that we're cautiously optimistic, but it's still entirely possible that this turns out well. And if that's the case, I would very much love to talk about this again with you in under better circumstances.
Oh yeah, it would very. I mean, it'd be very interesting to see what happens on Friday or between now and Friday,
Mm.
even. And if this materializes, to just sort of see what the negotiations are going to be about, and to what extent that 14-point plan was actually true. Because if it was, if this really is, that's still a win.
Oh yeah,
That's still a major win for Iran, a major win for Iran. But I'm just cautious because so much circulates, nobody confirms anything, then it all goes half to hell.
yeah,
Sorry, really rapidly. So I've gotten to the point that I try not to comment too much on these plans anymore until I'm like, okay,
yeah.
this is it, and then we can proceed from there on.
Agreed.
But yeah, it'll be interesting.
And I would just add to that, and I'm sure you'd agree, it wouldn't just be a win for Iran; it would be a win for humanity, including the actual
Oh
people
yeah,
of the United States, not the ruling class, but for humanity, it would be a huge win. So let's certainly hope for that.
yeah. Yeah, and I would actually be curious to see how how Israel does deal with this because we always talk. I always say like Israel does function as a proxy, but it's an
Hmm.
arrogant one.
Hmm.
And I've always personally argued that there will come a time where the United States and Israel will clash, and I think Israel has gone to a point where it's a little bit too big for its own boots,
Yeah,
and I don't think it understands how dependent it is on the United States itself.
yeah,
And at the end of the day, if the interests of the ruling class there, irrespective of what they are threatened by their actions in any way, well, that's going to be something that will be deemed as unacceptable. And we know that no matter who the U.S. has allied with, they have no problems. At some point, sooner or later, they do undercut those allies if it has to be done.
yeah,
So it'll be very interesting to see even how that will evolve. I'm not saying even now, but going forward,
yeah.
that's my opinion
Oh
anyway.
my God! That just from that angle, it's going to be fascinating to watch. I really hope that this is exactly one of those times that you described, and there's every reason in the world to believe it would be. But technically, my money is still on the Israel lobby, the Israeli forces within the U.S. and Israel winning. But that's just a personal bet that I would be very happy to lose. I would be extremely happy to lose that bet. So let's hope.
We'll see. We'll see. I'm just curious to see what's going to happen. Yeah. Well, I really don't know. We'll just have to see how this will go in the next few days. Even
Indeed.
I'll be surprised if this gets signed on the 19th.
Yeah, I know.
So we
Me
shall
too.
see.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Alina. It was great talking with you, and very much hope to meet up with you again to discuss what I hope to be really good news. One of those breaks that you just described.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Like I always say, I think I always argue, like, I think the contradictions, the US has collapsed its own contradictions. And if it's not now, it's in a few years. It's something that is at this stage is completely unavoidable.
Mm.
So I think it's something that we often forget when we look at the chaos, and we do look at their small wins here and there, but their small wins are never actual wins because actually in the long run, they end up causing a greater problem for them. And I think even Syria, for example, is a classic example of that. Yes, it can destabilize, but actually that destabilization probably will affect the United States more than it even does China at this particular point, because China has established long-term concrete relationships and long-term economic plans and self-sufficiency in a way that the US hasn't. And so have many of the BRIC states that are gradually moving in that kind of direction of self-sufficiency as well. So I think it's just always important to remember that and have some optimism because even if it doesn't happen now, it will happen at some point. That's my belief anyway.
From your lips to God's ears. I certainly hope so.
Mhm.
Well, it was great talking with you. Until next time, and let's hope for the best in the interim.
Thank you. It was lovely to have you. Well, to be here rather. And yeah, I look forward to more of our conversations. It was just a delight. Thank you so much.
Fantastic, fantastic.
Static crackles, voices rise. Truth breaks through their velvet lies. A screen of fire, a shield of steel. Bedbeat medium makes you feel no borders, no change, no silence.